Next up, I would like to introduce our next panel conversation, our Fireside Chat. It's going to be moderated by someone who's very familiar to all of you from last year, John Podesta. John, welcome to the stage.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Great to see you.
Thanks. Let me start by thanking Cheryl for all the great work she does at ARPA-E, and good morning to all of you. We're going to go from deep technological change, as you just saw in this last video, to talking about global energy markets. The topic of our discussion of this panel is the only constant is change, energy and the global perspective. To prove the point, I think you only have to go back 6 or 7 years to see how rapidly and unpredictably energy markets have changed. We've seen a tenfold jump in the estimates of recoverable gas reserves from the shale boom. We've seen oil imports fall from 12.5 million barrels a day in 2005 to 7.5 last year, headed to 6.1 million barrels a day in 2014. We've gone from more than 60% imports of oil to under 40%. In 2005, EIA estimated solar technologies would remain too costly to supply power to the grid. Last year, we added 3 gigawatts of solar capacity, bringing the total to 8 gigawatts. We've seen wind double over the last 4 years. We have rapidly evolving energy systems in the U.S. and globally, and we have 2 experts that can make predictions, perhaps with a little bit of humility, given how much has changed over the last 4 or 5 years, but make predictions about the rapidly changing circumstances in our energy sector. Blythe Masters is head of global commodities and corporate and investment bank regulatory affairs at J.P. Morgan Chase. She has more than 20 years of banking experience and serves on J.P. Morgan's executive committee. And David Gordon is head of research and director of global macro analysis at the Eurasia Group. Before joining the Eurasia Group, he had a long and distinguished career. We got to work together when he was in government, including a top management role at the National Intelligence Council and director of policy and planning at the State Department for Secretary Condoleezza Rice. So please join me in welcoming Blythe and David. So I mentioned that obviously a topic on the top of mind of most people watching the energy sector, which is the natural gas boom in the United States. So I want to start with the upside, and maybe Blythe, you might take the first question and talk about what in the short term this really means for the U.S. economy, not just for the energy sector, but more broadly. What does it mean for the U.S. economy? What advantages does it have for manufacturing, for other sectors of the economy with respect to that, particularly that low price of natural gas?
Thank you, and thanks for having me here. I think, to be honest, it's hard to overstate the importance that the shale boom, both gas and oil production, has had, is having, and will have on the economy of the United States. Obviously, at the simplest level, the key cost of a crucial input, energy, has declined as a result of the newfound abundance. That has facilitated switching of fuel that is used to generate electricity from environmentally challenged coal to a less environmentally damaged product, natural gas. It has lowered the price of electricity. In turn, that is attracting the redevelopment of lost manufacturing jobs right here in the United States. 10 years ago, the notion that we'd see greenfield smelting projects, ethylene chemical production re-emerging here in the United States was completely unthinkable. And yet that is, in fact, what we see today. In addition, there's the opportunity to switch our transportation fleet from less efficient oil-fired transportation fuel to compressed natural gas. A little-known fact is that there are about 3 million CNG vehicles in Iran and Pakistan and 1.5 million in China, about 120,000 of them here in the United States. Clearly, that isn't going to be the case much further into the future, given the relative abundance. That means the opportunity to switch to a less environmentally damaging and a more efficient transportation fleet, which is a huge opportunity for this economy. All of the things I've listed translate into growth and jobs at less expense to the environment.
One of the focuses of ARPA-E has been on technological change in the passenger fleet. How much of that do you think is necessary to get people to switch into CNG-type vehicles?
Well, obviously, there's a significant infrastructure build required. You need charging stations for electric vehicles. You need a distribution network for compressed natural gas. Both of those are underway, and it is the low price and relative abundance of natural gas that is incentivizing the investors and the financiers that are needed to make that infrastructure investment over the next few years. So it is a significant investment, but you can see it has already started to occur.
We might come back to the other sectors like the rail sector and heavy-duty trucks. But David, give us some quick thoughts on how this has affected the global market and how has this rippled through global supply chain. That you cover that now.
Yeah. So I think that Blythe's story about the game changer domestically carries over into the global arena. I think that we talk about us entering the post-peak oil period, that in recent years that scarcity has been the big concern. The fear is that there's not a lot of oil. It's left in places that are politically and geopolitically very funky. It's empowered a lot of governments whom have pretty nasty sides: Venezuela, Iran, Russia. So all of this is going to change now, and I think that there's actually some downward pressure on prices. I think we're likely to head into a price environment that's much more in the $80 to $90 range. I think that's going to be bullish for global growth. I think that the relationship between international oil companies and governments is going to be shifting. There's going to be a lot more incentives for collaboration with international oil companies. I think that the pressures on sort of bad governing arrangements in countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran all improve. So I think we're entering into a period in which the United States becomes one of the shapers rather than the takers of the global energy market.
Is the U.S. uniquely situated in this regard? What's happening with the development of unconventional gas globally? There are a couple of deals just recently announced in Western Australia, for example.
Yeah, so we are not uniquely situated. However, I think that our system is uniquely capable to move this. It's the combination of, we have the geology, we have the entrepreneurship, and we have the financial mechanisms to make all of this work. The geology is present in a lot of places. The other two pieces are much more problematic in not everywhere in the world. So this is going to be a much broader phenomenon than just the United States. But I do think that the take-up is going to be much, much, much slower in most other places. The Chinese are very ambitious about this. It's going to take them a long time.
They're water-starved in China, though. Is that,
absolutely.
Is that in terms of developing those resources?
They're water-starved, and they're also, they don't have the same mechanisms for getting these things started and taking the technology and applying it. But they have a huge water challenge on this. You're absolutely right, John.
Let's talk about what can interrupt this euphoria about natural gas. First, on the environmental side, one of the selling points has been the reduction in CO2 compared to alternative fuels, particularly coal fire power, dealing with the challenge of climate change. Is there risk in production and methane leakage, both at the well and through transportation, that wipes out that gain that you have from a CO2 perspective, and what's the industry doing to deal with that, Blythe?
So my thought on this question, and it's an excellent question, is that it's very important that it doesn't become a religious issue and it remains an issue for analysis. Yes, methane, fugitive methane emissions into the environment can be more powerfully damaging than CO2 emissions. The fact of the matter is methane emissions, fugitive methane exists throughout the existing conventional natural gas infrastructure, not just the shale gas expansion.
Go to Russia.
Right. There is an enormous amount of analysis being done as we speak to better understand questions exactly like this. This is, at its essence, a question of science. If you look at the extraordinary developments that have been made over the years in pursuit of environmental improvements and safety and health and safety, if we have the right information, given the correct incentives, price-wise and otherwise, my strong belief is that we will find ways to mitigate, contain, and otherwise manage the negative implications if they are significant. It's important that we allow that analysis to happen, that there is a balanced assessment, and policies, which are important, are taken on the basis of those findings to address concerns. We already know about other issues associated with shale gas extraction and fracking, implications for water contamination, water usage, water recycling, wellhead integrity. Enormous progress has been made in that area and needs to be continued to be made. And we need to foster an environment where the companies involved and the government actions taken work together to make this great gift of natural resource abundance into something that doesn't destroy our environment, and recognize that the United States is not the only country involved here. To the extent our LNG does not get developed, that will have knock-on effects internationally. If China cannot source gas, it will burn coal. So we have to think these through beyond our borders, in the context of international trade, in the context of scientific analysis and rational reasoned debate, and make big picture decisions for the long run.
Speaking of beyond our borders, there's been great debate about whether the DOE should license more gas to non-free trade agreement countries. And there's a recent report that concluded that it would be overall beneficial to the economy, but it might have some minimal, I would say, but minimal effect on consumer households. How do you see the export question these days, and do you think it's time for the DOE to move on the export license applications?
Well, I'm not here to advise the DOE on its process, and it's obviously going through an extensive process which needs to be undertaken. The study that was done didn't surprise me in its conclusions, since they broadly reiterated the benefits that are well known to all of us associated with free trade and how that can translate into benefits for economies taken as a whole. I'm sure that there are ways in which that study could be improved, but the bottom line is we all know it's a matter of established economic principle that free trade can lead to economic benefit. There are relative distribution effects between households, companies, and different parts of the economy within that. Overall, a couple of comments about exports. First of all, bear in mind that even today, in this abundance of natural gas and low gas prices, the United States still imports approximately 10% of what it consumes in natural gas from Canada.
From Canada, right.
And the Canadians have plans to export their natural gas if they don't sell it to the United States. And those plans are progressing on relatively parallel paths to the ones in the United States. Similarly, the Canadians are frustrated by the landlocked nature of their oil production, which they will also develop plans to export elsewhere if pipelines or other transportation alternatives into the United States aren't made available. So that should be borne in mind. Second of all, people have talked about the fact that there are enough permits for export out there to take away half of the natural gas consumed in the United States every year. There is no way that that will happen, even if it were left to the free market to decide, which it won't be. That's the price reaction from that will stop it from happening. There will not be the financing made available to facilitate that scale of exploitation. The risks involved are far too great. My sense is that allowing an element of exploitation will encourage continued investment in the shale gas and other energy investments in this country. It will take away the negative impacts that lower prices have had on those incentives. And ultimately, it will help the United States potentially balance trade imbalances and other strategic issues with key international partners, not least of which being China.
David, jump in on this.
Yeah, so I think that access to natural gas is one of the drivers of the keen interest of both our Pacific partners and our European partners in these very, very big trade agreements. So I think that that even under current law, I think that natural gas is already playing a positive role in empowering the United States to be at the center of this new matrixed trans-Pacific and transatlantic trade and investment regulatory regime that if and when these two agreements are reached, and I think they will be, it'll take a little while, they will be, that you really have the beginnings of what will be a very attractive club to join in. And again, this becomes part of the resurgence of soft power for the United States.
Certainly seemed to be at the center of the discussion with Prime Minister Abe in the recent discussion.
Yeah, that's the big ask. Abe's big ask is.
Speaking of which, they're on track to close down they've closed down a substantial portion of their nuclear program. Yeah. They're restarting a little of it. Yeah. Well, how do you see the nuclear issue playing out over the next couple of decades? So
the nuclear issue, I want to get back to the point of potential downsides. And the nuclear issue is a cautionary story here for unconventionals. So it has been the case that mishaps and tragedies have prevented technologies that had great promise from being achieved. And while I think that the risks are less here, I think the points that Blythe was making about really covering that regulatory and environmental side is extremely important because I think that the biggest risk here around unconventionals and shale is the potential for a major mishap. On the nuclear side, I think, frankly, that the effect of all of this is to raise the bar for other energy forms.
Right.
And I think nuclear, the bar is really being raised. And is nuclear going to go away? No. But I think, again,
new build in the OECD pretty much gone.
Yeah, I think and even in China, India, these places that had really seen nuclear as a large part, this could actually play a role in dampening that.
David was quite involved with a report out of the NIC called Global Trends, which really was groundbreaking, looking ahead 15 years. I want to read the 2000 report, which you worked on, that predicted 2015. It said, in 2000, fossil fuels will remain the dominant form of energy despite increasing concerns about global warming. In 2012, the 2030 report had this to say: climate change will worsen the outlook for the availability of food, water, and energy. Climate change analysis suggests that the severity of existing weather patterns will intensify, with wet areas getting wetter, dry areas becoming more so. Much of the decline in participation will occur in the Middle East, North Africa, etc. With respect to climate change, is this a mixed blessing?
Yeah.
A few years ago, in fact, I wrote a report with former Senator Tim Wirth saying it was the bridge fuel to a more climate-friendly energy base. But are we crowding out renewables now, like we might be crowding out nuclear?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question, and I do think that a lot of the impetus for renewables that looked like it was climate driven were as much driven by this expectation, this peak oil concept, and that clearly has gone away. So the climate change case doesn't change, but the energy context of climate change does really shift, and so I think it gets harder. I think that climate change, it gets harder to get the big global agreement. But I think a lot of the upside on climate change really is on the technology side, both on technologies having to do with energy utilization and technologies having to do with production. But I do think that it's very, very hard to see a global kind of agreement that the post-Kyoto framework that we've been talking about for years, I mean, I just don't see it happen.
Maybe I'll take a slightly different angle on that. And I don't disagree fundamentally, although I think another side to the argument that should be at least contemplated is that if you think back to where we were a few years ago, pre-financial crisis, pre-global recession, there was widespread talk of cap and trade, potentially on a global basis, potentially including the United States. Peak oil theory abundant. The shale gas revolution was not yet obvious to most of us. What caused most of that to fall off the tracks was the financial crisis and global recession, which meant that priorities associated with curtailing and reversing unemployment trends and improving growth trends became more important in the near term for most policymakers and governments. Mm-hmm. The way I see the shale gas opportunity is in that context, which is that actually if you look at the statistics, certainly in the United States, the use of coal in our electricity generation is declining rapidly.
Absolutely.
But for gas, that would not have been possible to achieve without significant adverse impact on growth, employment, etc. in the United States, which would not have been acceptable politically given what else was going on. The world didn't have a realistic or viable bridging mechanism between heavy use of coal and oil and getting to the nirvana where some new technology, including renewables, would take up the baseload associated with all of that. The reality is that we're able to switch away from coal and to gas for baseload generation and potentially for transportation uses in a way that makes achieving an environmental outcome that is acceptable politically possible at all. So it may be delaying things, but I think it's also facilitating things, and that balance needs to be acknowledged and managed.
You've been quite involved with designing carbon markets. The EU's trading scheme is close to collapse, from my observation. What's it going to take? What kind of a price signal will it take to move investment into efficiency and into renewables, into zero carbon energy?
So I think putting a price on carbon and other externalities that damage the environment is a necessary part of the equation, whether you do it via taxation or via cap and trade or otherwise. There are various different approaches to that. It would be hard to argue that the European trading scheme has been a success under the circumstances. The reality is that it was a concept that could have worked, but the devil is in the details, and the design and the supply-demand balance was materially miscalculated. Essentially, too much supply was permitted by construction. This is a government-designed or a policy-designed market that probably for political and or socioeconomic reasons led to decisions that meant the price impact would not be significant enough. The net result is we have carbon prices essentially at zero, and the incentive to change technologies has gone away. What does that mean? Well, it means that we need to do better next time. It means that the design needs to be better, and we need to stay true to what the policy objectives are in the way things are designed. I, for one, believe that it is very difficult to centrally manage all of the sources of innovation and investment initiatives that are required to achieve major infrastructural innovation in any economy. But looking at the way innovation has occurred in the United States, it's organic. So the idea of using price signals that are transmitted equally to all parts of the economy and make the alternative economics of lower carbon fuels more attractive is appealing because it gives all technologies an equal chance. It doesn't have the government picking winners and losers. Sometimes you need governments to weigh in and pick winners and losers. For example, on the nuclear front, the scale of the investments required there are so gigantic that the private sector is going to struggle.
Let me push you on one issue there. Because of the complexity of the U.S. economy, is it possible to segregate transportation from the electric generation sector from the industrial sector? Because that's apparently what we're about to embark on.
Well, I mean,
through direct regulation.
Not really. Well, so for example, electric cars today are plugged into grids which are being supplied by generators that burn coal. And so if you do that mental arithmetic, you kind of wonder what that was all about. So obviously these things are at certain points interlinked from a technology point of view. Right. But I, for one, certainly wouldn't advocate picking winners and losers within the different segments of the economy with that degree of precision. I think it would be very hard to get right.
David, let me shift gears on you a little bit and talk about Iran and get your intelligence expertise. If things go badly in the negotiations, which are restarted but with low expectations, what do you think the effect on global energy markets could be as early as perhaps this summer?
Yeah, so I do think there is going to be continuing upward pressure on global energy prices both from the Iran nuclear problem, but also I think we're looking at the civil war in Syria spreading into Iraq and the trajectory of supply growth coming out of Iraq, I think, is likely to be
which is most of the global supply growth predicted in the next 10 years.
That's right. So I do believe, though, that the unconventionals revolution has already had a very positive impact on Iran. And 2 or 3 years ago, when we were really thinking about how do you ratchet up sanctions here, how do you squeeze the Iranians, oil was essentially off the agenda because taking Iran's oil, a large proportion of off the market, would have had this huge price impact and hurt everybody, hurt others more than the Iranians. But the unconventionals revolution has allowed us to really tighten the noose on Iran. Half their oil has been taken off the market. We'll continue in that trajectory. So I do think that right now the Iranians are not in the mood to negotiate. I'm not optimistic. But the goal of sanctions has always been to have the Iranians make the choice between having a nuclear program or having an economy. And before you had this shift in the supply situation, you didn't have a pathway to get from here to there. Now you do. But if things go bad, I do think that
really bad
now. The war scenarios here, the war scenario is one that opens up all of these potential really disastrous scenarios, and in particular a conflict between the U.S. and Israel and Iran bleeding into this larger war, because in the Iranian mind they're under attack from not just the West and Israel, but also from the Sunni powers and particularly Saudi Arabia. And if the Iranians targeted some of the Saudi facilities, then you have a big supply impact. I think in some ways, frankly, the power of sanctions makes a larger case for containment. I'm not advocating that, but I think the notion that containment shouldn't be on the table in thinking about how we deal with Iran, that the ability of us to take Iran's oil off grid should be part of the equation in thinking about how we respond to an emerging crisis.
Blythe, obviously the Iran sanctions are built into the financial system at this point, but is this a kind of top-of-the-mind topic in global energy markets, and particularly the oil market?
Yes, this concern has been there, remains there.
Is it built into the price?
Yep, it's built into the price, and that, the extent of the risk premium associated with that can be debated, and it's ebbed and flowed at different points in time. But the essential argument that the removal of Iranian oil from the market has been replaced by other sources of energy, which in turn has been facilitated by the shale oil expansion in the United States, is absolutely correct. And the idea that this represents an opportunity to diminish geopolitical risk and, or just as importantly, strengthen key strategic relationships. And I keep coming back to China on this point. China needs that LNG, just like we need them to continue to invest in our financial markets and buy U.S. Treasury bonds. That is a really important, positive, win-win potential trade and relationship forging connection between two gigantic economies in the face of situations like Iran, Israel.
Well, speaking of the all of the above economy in China, how does China perceive the relative decrease in energy security vis-a-vis the United States?
There's a really interesting debate going on now in China about, is the U.S. a resilient power or not? And in 2010, 2011, the hardliners in the PLA dominated that debate with, no, the United States is not a resilient power. And I think the debate is shifting now to, yes, the United States is a resilient power, and the energy side of this is really important. The big issue, I think Blythe is absolutely right. We have a gigantic opportunity with the Chinese to get to win-win. The Chinese don't look at market issues or geopolitical issues generally in win-win. So they're very skeptical about this. It's not going to be easy to do. But I think there's an enormous opportunity. It's going to take a little while. The Chinese new leadership has to show its toughness at first. But I do think energy and energy diplomacy is a pathway back to a more constructive relationship with China.
We just have a minute left, but last question. Over the last 10 years, we've seen coal take up about half of the space of new energy deployment, particularly because of China and India. China now has nearly double the emissions of the U.S., nearly the same per capita emissions as the EU. What's the next 10 years going to look like for coal?
A lot depends on what the next 10 years look like for natural gas. So if I got to pick the two, I know which one I would vote for.
And do you think that is there an expectation that switch will happen, and that there's going to be a downward slope globally on coal consumption and CO2 emissions?
The world is going to be burning coal for a long time to come, unfortunately, unless something really game-changing comes along that none of us has yet got in our minds. The fact of natural gas will reduce the extent to which that has to be true, provided that we make sure that the environmental catastrophe that you referred to as a risk doesn't happen. And given the very nature of shale gas extraction, my sense is that it's very different from nuclear in terms of the environmental risks that are raised. My sense is that is a manageable environmental concern. So that would be where my focus is focus on getting natural gas regulation from an environmental point of view right, regulation and behavior by industry, and that will help reduce dependency on coal globally.
David?
I think that China, you have this enormous middle class in China. What are they looking for? They're looking for transparency. The government isn't giving them this. I think the environmental movement is set to really mushroom in China. I think one of the biggest things that they're going to be promoting is exactly this transition, speeding up the transition away from coal. And I think that's something that the regime will have an easier time responding to.
China introduced a carbon tax proposal last week.
Yeah. Right.
Did everybody hear that? Say that a little louder.
China introduced a carbon tax proposal last week.
Well, I'm just going to close by saying the one thing that could interfere with the scenario that you described is the real security implications of climate change, which we only feel the tip of the iceberg on right now. Please join me in thanking two really great panelists. Really great to have you. Thanks. Great.